Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The Honorable Professor Fuad Abdul Hamid as the lecturer of Advanced Research Method and dear colleagues. Okay, right now our group that consists of Bu Susilawati, Bu Sulasri Manulung, and myself and Suryana will be talking about qualitative data collection. The topic to be presented today about qualitative data analysis. There are 9 topics to be discussed. Qualitative data, sampling in qualitative research and ethnography. The first 3 parts here will be explained by myself. And the next part, interviews, focus group interviews, and introspective methods will be discussed by Ibu Susilawati. And last part, that's about case studies, diary studies, and research journals will be delivered by Bu Sulastri Manurung. Okay, without further ado, let's start with the first part. What is qualitative data? As you know that both quantitative and qualitative data are very important in language classroom research. But when it comes to making sense of research, qualitative data comes first. In saying this, we mean that while qualitative data can be quantified, all quantitative research must ultimately be referenced against the qualitative sources that gave rise to them in the first place. For example, a researcher investigating the good language learner might collect test scores from a sample of secondary school language learners. Good learners might be operationally defined as those students who score better than 2 standard deviations above the mean of the sample as a whole. In order for the study to have any value, the researcher would then need to identify what it was that gave rise to the scores in the first place. Okay, qualitative research focuses on describing, understanding, and clarifying a human experience, directed at describing the aspects that make up an idiosyncratic experience rather than determining the most likely or mean experience within a group. And in textual form of qualitative data, usually qualitative data consists of mixture of field notes, transcripts of various recordings, as well as documents of diverse nature and length. Characteristic of qualitative data. In qualitative research, there are no explicit restriction on what can be considered data, and as Richards in 2009, in 2005 concludes that the researcher in a qualitative project often starts out by treating everything around a topic as potential data. Thus, qualitative data expands quickly, and novice researchers often find that the real challenge is not to generate enough data, but rather than to generate useful data. In fact, a serious problem in qualitative research can be too much data, which is augmented by the fact that qualitative data are messy records, usually consisting of a mixture of field notes, transcripts of various recordings, as well as documents of a diverse nature and length. This doesn't mean that qualitative data cannot produce valuable results, but it does mean that processing such sizable and heterogeneous data sets can involve a lot of work. And the case of a recent research student of mine is not that unusual. On a 3-week data collection field trip back to her home country, she gathered so much data that she spent the next 8 months translating, transcribing, and preliminary coding it, which cut dangerously into her remaining time for follow-up data collection and second-order analysis. And then the other side of the coin is that although we need to be careful to be selective during data collection, we must not forget either that qualitative research is by definition less systematic and standardized in its data collection approach than quantitative research. And that the messiness of the rich data that we are aiming for ease, often merely a reflection of the complex real-life situation. The data concerns, in order to tap into core participant meanings, we often need to follow multiple strategies into multiple directions at multiple levels. Accordingly, the design of most qualitative data collection is fluid and open-ended, and researchers are not required to plan all elements of the project at the code level. While this is in line with the discovery-oriented character of qualitative inquiry, research in 2005 also traces that possibly the most common cause of problems in qualitative data collection is the lack of any plans for data reduction. As he argues, novice researchers can very easily frame the scale of a project in terms of how widely they might need to spread their net, rather than how wide realistically the spread can be. Okay, sampling in qualitative research. According to Polkington's 2005 qualitative research focuses on describing, understanding, and clarifying a human experience, and therefore qualitative studies are directed at describing the aspects that make up an idiosyncratic experience rather than determining the most likely or mean experience within a group. Instead, the main goal of sampling is to find individuals who can provide rich and varied insights into the phenomenon under investigation so as to maximize what we can learn. So this goal is best achieved by means of some sort of purposeful or purposive sampling. And then in their influential work on grounded theory, Glaser and Strauss in 1967 spoke about theoretical sampling, highlighting the fact that sampling should be flexible, ongoing, involving process of selecting successive respondents or sites directed by our earlier discoveries so that the emerging ideas and theoretical concepts can be tested and further refined. And then theoretical sampling has been transferred from grounded theory to qualitative research in general, and in current practice, it is typically used synonymously with purposive sampling. And then researchers are in agreement that the participant selection process should remain open in a qualitative study as long as possible so that after initial accounts are gathered and analyzed, additional participants can be added who can fill gaps in the initial description or can expand or even challenge it. This clinical process of moving back and forth between data collection and analysis is often referred to as iteration. Although iteration is a key process in qualitative sampling, it cannot go on forever. There are no rigid guidelines, but scholars agree that ideally the iterative process should go on until we reach saturation. Saturation is the point when the researcher becomes empirically confident that he or she has all the data needed to answer the research question. Finally, let's discuss the fundamental question: how big should be the sample size be in a qualitative study? After all, we can talk about the flexibility of the process of iteration, but in reality, most researchers need to make some sort of an initial plan about the sample size to schedule their investigation. An interview study with an initial sample size of 6 to 10 might work well. And purposive sampling can follow a number of different strategies depending on the research topic and setting. The following list of the most common qualitative sampling strategies offer an idea of how widely we need to throw the net in order to achieve saturation in different research areas. The first part, the specific sampling strategies are about homogeneous sampling. Homogeneous sampling refers to the researcher selects participants from a particular subgroup who share some important experience relevant to our study. For example, they have participated in a study abroad program. This way, this strategy allows us to conduct an in-depth analysis to identify common patterns in a group with similar characteristics, and typical sampling. Typical sampling, the researcher selects participants whose experience is typical with regard to the research focus. For example, they all study a foreign language as a school subject at intermediate level with moderate success. This strategy assumes that we have a profile of the targeted attributes possessed by an average learner. Although we cannot generalize from the result because we cannot claim that everybody will have the same experience, we can list the typical or normal features of the experience. And the criterion sampling. In this part of specific sampling strategies, criterion sampling refers that the researcher selects participants who meet some specific predetermined criteria. For example, company executives who fail an important language exam. Okay, and then maximum variation sampling. In this part, the researcher selects cases with markedly different forms of experience. For example, L2 learners from all developmental levels. This process will allow us to explore the variation within the respondents, and it will also underscore any commonalities that we find. If a pattern holds across the sample diversity, we can assume that it is reasonably stable. And the fifth is extreme or deviant case sampling. Following the same logic as maximum variation sampling, the researcher selects the most extreme cases, for example, the most motivated and demotivated learners. On the one hand, this allows us to find the limits of the experience. On the other hand, if even such cases share common elements, they are likely to be real core components of the experience. And the last part, that is critical case sampling. In this part, the researcher deliberately targets cases which often offer the dramatic or full representation of the phenomenon, either by their intensity or by their uniqueness. For example, in language attrition study, examining people who have completely. Okay, now we continue about the sample strategies. The most practical and feasible and cost most common sampling strategies are the least sound from a theoretical point of view. The success principle strategies are particularly well known as snowball or chain sampling, opportunistic sampling, and convenient sampling. Snowball or chain sampling. Here is the starting point of this strategy. It's a principled list of key respondents who are then asked to recruit further participants who are similar to them in some respect central to the investigation. This chain reaction can reach far, which is the ideal in situation where the experience in question is rare. And then about the opportunistic sampling. This is an unplanned and potentially a haphazard procedure in the sense that it is followed on the spur of the moment. While working in the field, the researcher sometimes comes across respondents who are too good to miss, and the decision to include them is made on the spot. The problem is that they are not always exactly what is needed, yet their selection is very much in line with the emergent nature of the qualitative inquiry. While the convenient sampling, this is the least desirable but the most common sampling strategy, at least at the postgraduate research level. It is not purposive but largely practical. The researchers use those who are available. And then the next part is about ethnography study. A good starting point in our exploration of the specific qualitative methods of discovery is ethnography, because this approach embodies in many ways the essence of the qualitative inquiry. In fact, ethnography has frequently been used as a synonym for qualitative research. Originating in cultural Anthropology. Ethnographic research aims at describing and analyzing practice and beliefs of culture. Culture is not limited to ethnic groups but can be related to any bounded units. Harklaw 2005, such as organization, programs, and even listening communities. Thus, we can talk about the ethnography of the language classroom or the ethnographic analysis of specific schools or other language learning contexts. Classic image of the ethnographic is a researcher who enters into the community and becomes immersed in its culture. For example, by living among natives on a remote island for several years, for this reason, ethnography has been criticized in this part for representing as a colonialist attitude. But since we are looking at the educational application of the method, we do not have to review this debate here. And the main goal of most ethnographic research is to provide a thick description of the target culture. That is a narrative that describes richly and in a great deal the daily life of the community as well as the cultural meanings and beliefs the participants attach to their activities, events, and behaviors. Okay, and then main features of an ethnographic study. According to Harklaw 2005, a hallmark of classic ethnography research is that it involves first and participant observation in a natural setting, and most studies that frame themselves as ethnographic include some degree of this method. Okay, so let's see the first part of main features of an ethnographic study, focusing on participant meaning. In ethnographic studies, the participants' subjective interpretation of their own behaviors and customs is seen as crucial to understanding the specific culture. Therefore, a central aspect of ethnography is to find ways of looking at events through the eyes of insider, and then prolong engagement in the natural setting. The subtitles of the press participants' meaning and most often multiple meanings cannot be uncovered unless the researcher immerses him or herself in the culture and spends an extended period living there. Observing the participants and collecting data, therefore, a minimum stay of 6 to 12 months is usually recommended to achieve the necessary prolonged engagement. And the third part, that's immersion nature. Because the ethnographer is entering a new culture, the exact focus of the research will be contextually and immersed in situ only after some field work has been done. Okay, next see the main phases of an ethnographic study. Ethnographic study involves a complex process of getting in and coming out, which can be described as a sequence of four relatively distinct phases. Morsis and Risa 2002, and she also discarded 2005. Let's see the first part. The first phase involves entering what is it for the researcher a strange environment. The ethnographer needs to negotiate the entry with the gatekeepers and also find a way, reason, or adequate role for fitting in. In L2 research, gatekeepers are likely to be heard teachers, school managers, principals, various education officials who, as recent 2005 on page 121, points out that all have their own particular access to grid and territories to protect. Therefore, this is rather delicate phase. The researcher is understandably somewhat lost and doesn't understand the setting or the participant. As a consequence of piece data collection in this space largely involves mapping the terrain, deciding who's who and who, in general keeping a diary with field notes. And then the second step, or second phase. The second phase is easier in many ways than the first because by now the ice has been broken and the researcher has become familiar with the participants and the routines in the setting. Non-participants observation is now in full swing and the critical task of finding key information begins, along with conducting initial interviews with him. At this stage, the ethnography also need to start analyzing the preliminary data to develop some initial ideas and concepts. And then the third phase, this is the most productive research phase. Acculturation has been completed and the researcher has been accepted a lot and now feels at home in the setting. This allows him or her to employ a variety of techniques to collect increasingly focused data, which is used to verify initial hypotheses and ideas and to develop broader theoretical concepts. Data analysis at this stage is characterized by progressive focusing, noun shifting, sorting, and reviewing the data. And the final phase is the necessary withdrawal. This may be an emotionally taxing close phrase. The final phase is the necessary withdrawal. This may be an emotionally taxing closure phase and evoking a feeling of loss. And the other hand, okay, and then Slide 11. Strengths and weaknesses of ethnography research. The ethnographic approach is particularly useful for exploring uncharted territories and understanding social processes from the participants' perspective. It is the next topic is about ethnographic study. A good starting point in our exploration of the specific qualitative method of discovery is ethnography because this approach embodies in many ways the essence of the qualitative inquiry. In fact, ethnography has frequently been used as a synonym for qualitative research. Originating in cultural anthropology, ethnographic research aims at describing and analyzing the practices and beliefs of cultures. Culture is not limited to ethnic groups but can be related to any bonded units. Our 2005, such as organization, programs, and even distinct communities. Thus, we can talk about the ethnography of the language classroom or the ethnographic analysis of specific school or other language learning contexts. The main goal of the most ethnographic research is to provide a thick description of the target culture, that is, a narrative that describes richly and in great detail the daily life of the community as well as the cultural meanings and beliefs the participant attach to their activities, events, and behaviors. For this purpose, ethnography uses an eclectic range of data collection techniques, including participant and non-participant observation. And then the main features of an ethnographic study. According to Harklaw, a hallmark of classic ethnographic research is that it involves first-hand participant observation in a natural setting, and most studies that frame themselves as ethnographic include degree of this method. The first part is focusing on participant meaning. In ethnographic studies, the participant's subjective interpretation of their own behaviors and customs is seen as crucial to understanding the specific culture. Therefore, a central aspect of ethnography is to find ways of looking at events through the eyes of an insider. And the second is prolonged engagement in the natural setting. The subtleties of the participant meaning, and most often multiple meaning, cannot be uncovered unless the researcher immerses him or herself in the culture and spends an extended period of living there, observing the participants and collecting data. Therefore, a minimum stay of 6 to 12 months is usually recommended to achieve the necessary prolonged engagement. And the third is emergent nature. Because the ethnographer is entering a new culture, the exact focus of the research will evolve contextually and emerge in situ only after some fieldwork has been done. An ethnographic study involves a complex process of getting in and coming out, which can be described as a sequence of four relatively distinct phases. The first phase involves entering what is for the researcher a strange environment. The ethnographer needs to negotiate the entry with the gatekeeper and then find a way, reason, or adequate role for fitting in. And the second is easier in many ways. The second step. The second phase is easier in many ways than the first because by now the ice has been broken and the researcher has become familiar with the participants and the routines in the setting. Non-participant observation is now in full swing, and the critical task of finding key informants begin along with conducting initial interviews with them. At this stage, ethnographer also needs to start analyzing the preliminary data to develop some initial ideas and concepts. And the third phase is the most productive research phase. Acculturation has been completed and the researcher has been accepted and now feels at home in the setting. This allows him or her to employ a variety of techniques to collect increasingly focused data, which is used to verify initial hypotheses and ideas and to develop broader theoretical concepts. Data analysis at this stage is characterized by progressive focusing, involving sifting, sorting, and reviewing the data. And the final phase is the necessary withdrawal. This may be an emotionally taxing closer phase, evoking a feeling of loss. And the ethnographer needs to make sure that he or she disengages from the field in a way that brings as little disruption to the group or situation as possible. The focus is on data analysis and additional data is collected only to fill gaps, to resolve ambiguities, and to validate previous findings. Okay, and then the strengths and weaknesses of ethnographic research. The ethnographic approach is particularly useful for exploring uncharted territories and understanding social processes from the participants' perspective. It is an excellent way of crossing cultures and gaining insight into the life of organizations, institutions, and communities. In short, ethnography is ideal for generating initial hypotheses about something totally unknown. Horbergner in 1994 also highlights the capacity of ethnography to take a holistic view and focus on the whole picture that leaves nothing uncounted for and that reveals the interrelatedness of all the component parts. The main drawback of the approach is that the need for prolonged engagement with the participant in their natural setting requires an extensive time investment that few academic researchers can afford. Okay, that is the first part of the presentation from me. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.